1887, Nebraska. The stranger collapsed before he reached Margaret's porch. A 2-year-old boy clung weakly to his back, while a little girl in a faded pink dress held his hand. The man had not eaten in 3 days, yet he did not ask for food for himself. He removed his battered hat, sank to his knees, and looked up at the lonely widow. "Please," he whispered, "I beg you, feed my children." Margaret stared at the 3 exhausted figures beneath the merciless summer sun. She was 34 years old, widowed, and only weeks away from losing the farm she and her late husband had built together. Nebraska was dying beneath a sky that had forgotten the color of rain. The corn was yellow, the cattle were thin, and the bank was waiting for Margaret to fail. But as she looked at the starving children, Margaret understood one thing clearly. Whatever little food remained in her cabin would belong to them that night. Then she looked more closely at the stranger's face. It was marked by exhaustion and a sorrow too old for words. His hair was dark, matted, and thick with grime. His skin had been darkened by weeks beneath the relentless sun, but his eyes were a startling, piercing blue. They were haunting. They were the eyes of a man who had watched his entire world burn to ash. He looked at the little girl shivering beside him. Her face was pale beneath a thick layer of prairie dust. Her lips were white and cracked. They were bleeding from the dryness. "I haven't eaten in 3 days," the man whispered. "That doesn't matter to me. I can endure the hunger. But they are fading. I am watching them die before my eyes." He bowed his head low to the ground. His exhausted shoulders shook with silent sobs. Margaret did not hesitate for a single second. The rules of the frontier were simple and sacred. You did not turn away the starving. You did not close your door to the lost. She stepped off the porch. The heat radiated off the ground in waves. It burned through her thin, worn soles. She reached out a hand toward the stranger. The man flinched at her movement. He looked like a stray dog that expected a blow instead of a touch. "Come inside, Musa," Margaret said. "Man." Her voice was soft but firm. "The sun is no friend to the weary." She gently helped the little girl up the wooden stairs. The child's hand felt like a bundle of dry twigs. The man forced himself to stand. His long legs trembled violently with the effort. He followed her into the cool shadows of the cabin. The room smelled of dried summer herbs and old wood. It was a humble, tiny space, but it was a sanctuary. Margaret pointed to a sturdy wooden bench. "Sit," she commanded. She went immediately to the cast-iron stove. She had a small pot of vegetable stew left. It was mostly clear broth and shriveled potatoes, but it was warm. It was life in a bowl. She poured the liquid into 3 mismatched ceramic bowls. She set them on the table with 2 thick slices of rye bread. The children began to eat. Their desperation was painful to witness. They didn't speak. They didn't look up. They focused only on the life-giving warmth of the food. The man sat perfectly still. His hands were folded tightly in his lap. He watched his children with an intensity that made Margaret's chest ache. He didn't touch his own bowl. "Eat, Mr." Margaret paused, waiting for a name. "Elias," he finally said. "Elias Thorne." "Eat your soup, Mr. Thorne," Margaret insisted. He shook his head slowly. His eyes never left the small faces of the children. "Let them finish every drop first. There might not be enough for their next meal tomorrow." Margaret felt a hard, painful lump in her throat. This man was prepared to starve so they could live one more day. "I have more in the pot, I promise," she lied. She leaned against the rough wooden counter. Her heart ached with a sudden, sharp empathy. She thought of Thomas. Thomas had died 2 years ago. A relentless fever had swept through the valley like a plague. It was like a scythe cutting through ripe wheat. Now she was a widow at 34. She was holding on to her homestead with nothing but raw grit. Elias finally took a hesitant, trembling spoonful. He closed his eyes as he swallowed the warmth. A single, salt-streaked tear escaped his eye. It ran through the thick dust on his hollow cheek. He looked up and locked eyes with Margaret. "I have no silver to pay you for this kindness," he said. "I didn't ask for silver," she replied softly. "And I don't want any." He stood up. Even in his ragged clothes, he carried himself with quiet dignity. He walked to the small, dusty window. He looked out at the parched, dying fields of her farm. He studied the ranch with the practiced eye of a master well driller. "You are losing this place, aren't you?" he asked. Margaret stiffened. Her pride flared up like a sudden flame. "I am managing just fine on my own." "The bank says otherwise," he countered softly. "I saw your name on the foreclosure notice outside the bank." "I worked near a cattle camp east of here last spring," Elias explained. "The surveyors were already marking a new route through this valley." Margaret turned away. Her throat felt tight and constricted. It was the bitter, undeniable truth. She was months behind on her mortgage payments. The town banker, Mr. Miller, was a cold and calculating man. He was waiting for her to fail. Miller had been waiting for the drought to leave her too desperate to resist him. Elias turned back to her. His blue eyes burned with a new, fierce light. "You saved the lives of my children today. You gave us the last of what you had in your pantry. I make you a solemn, unbreakable promise. Margaret, feed my children for the rest of this summer. Give them a roof so they don't have to sleep in the dirt. And I will save your farm from the bank." Margaret looked at him for a long, silent time. "Mr. Miller doesn't want this land because it's worthless," Elias continued. "He wants it because he knows the new cattle trail will pass close to this property. Without water, you'll lose everything to him. But with water, this ranch becomes priceless." Margaret looked at her old wooden well. It was bone dry. The corn in the field was yellow and stunted. "I am a master stonemason and a well driller," Elias said. "I know the secrets the earth hides beneath the dust. The bank thinks the water in this county is gone forever, but I can find a deeper vein of water, one this drought has not yet touched. I can build you a windmill that will never stop turning." Margaret looked at the sleeping boy on the bench. She looked at the girl in the faded pink dress. She knew she had no other choice. "Stay," she said. The word hung heavily in the silence. "I have an abandoned tool shed behind the house. It's dry and it's safe from the wind." Elias nodded once. The pact was sealed in the silence of the room. "I will start digging at first light." That night, Margaret carried a thin mattress and 2 folded blankets to the tool shed. Elias tried to protest, but she silenced him with a look. "Your children need their father strong," she said. "That means you must sleep and eat as well." He lowered his eyes, unused to being included in anyone's concern. Mary stood in the doorway holding a small piece of bread she had saved from supper. She broke it in half and offered one piece to him. "You said we eat first," she whispered. "Tonight, you eat with us." Elias accepted it with both hands, as though the child had placed something sacred in his palms. Later, Margaret watched from the porch as he tucked the blankets around Toby and Mary. He remained beside them until their breathing became slow and peaceful. Only then did he sit against the wall of the shed and close his eyes. Margaret realized he had probably spent every night on the trail awake, listening for danger and fearing that one of his children might not survive until morning. Before returning to the cabin, she left a cup of water beside him. Elias opened his eyes and saw it. Neither of them spoke, but in that silent exchange, the first fragile thread of trust was drawn between them. The next few weeks were a frantic blur of labor. Margaret woke every morning at 4. The sky was still purple and bruised. She boiled water for coffee. She baked bread in the heavy iron oven. She watched Elias from the kitchen window. He was a man of very few words. He spent his days in the blistering white-hot sun. He dug a deep, dark hole behind the house. At first, it looked like a grave. Then, he began to build. He gathered heavy, flat stones from a creek bed miles away. He hauled them on his broad back. His muscles strained beneath the weight. He worked until his hands bled and the skin peeled. The sun darkened his skin and hardened his hands. That night, Margaret sat on the porch, She mended his frayed, sweat-stained shirts by lamplight. The fabric was so thin it was almost transparent. She used her best silk thread for the seams. It was a silent sacrifice of her own. She watched the children begin to heal under her care. After weeks of food and rest, 2-year-old Toby began walking steadily again. Mary, the girl in pink, helped Margaret in the garden. Margaret taught Mary how to sew with a needle. They worked together on a 9-patch quilt block. The children loved the bright, colorful scraps of fabric. They sat together on the weathered porch steps. The smell of dried lavender filled the evening air. "My mother had a quilt just like this one," Mary whispered. "She died on the trail coming west." Margaret felt a sharp, stabbing pang of grief. She pulled the small, fragile girl closer to her side. "Then we shall make this one even better," Margaret said. "Every stitch we make is a memory kept alive." The townspeople began to whisper in the shadows. Gossip traveled faster than a prairie fire in July. Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, stopped by one afternoon. She looked at Elias with pure disdain. He was covered in thick mud and salty sweat. "It isn't proper, Margaret," she hissed through her teeth. "A widow housing a man with no references, no property, and no known history. The children were starving to death." "Sarah," Margaret replied, "is it proper to let children die in the dirt?" Mrs. Gable drove away in a huff of dust. But the seeds of a scandal were already sown in the dry soil. A few days later, Mr. Miller arrived. He came in a polished, black carriage. He wore a suit that cost more than Margaret's entire house. He looked down into the deep, dark pit Elias had dug. He threw back his head and laughed a cold, cruel laugh. "You're digging for ghosts, Thorne. This entire county is a dead dust bowl. Your overdue mortgage payments must be made within 1 month. Margaret, on that day, I expect the keys to this house or the cash." Elias didn't even look up at the man. He kept swinging his heavy iron pickaxe. The sound of metal striking stone echoed across the plains. Clink, clink, clink. It was the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the farm. Cold fear swept through Margaret. What if Elias was wrong? What if there was no water down there that evening? She walked to the edge of the deep pit. Elias was sitting at the very bottom. The moon was silver, cold, and indifferent. "Are you all right?" she called down into the dark. He slowly looked up. His face was hollowed out by the shadows. "The stone down here is harder than I thought, but I can feel the change in the air. The earth is getting cold and heavy beneath my feet. The water's close, Margaret. I can feel it calling to the surface." He climbed out, his movements stiff and pained. Margaret sat down on the grass beside him. She handed him a cool, damp cloth for his face. Their fingers brushed together for a fleeting second. It was an unexpected, electric spark. Margaret gently washed the grit from his calloused palms. He stayed perfectly silent, watching her. "Why are you doing this for me?" he asked softly. "The whole town hates you for letting a stranger stay." Margaret looked up at the infinite, cold stars. "I know what it's like to be completely alone. Elias, my husband and I built this house with our bare hands. I won't let a man in a silk suit take my soul away." Elias closed his hand firmly around hers. "I will not let him take a single inch of your land. I promise you that on my very life." The bond between them shifted in that moment. It was no longer just a business bargain. It was a sacred partnership of two broken souls. Over the days that followed, Margaret noticed the quiet ways Elias respected the life she had built with Thomas. He never entered the cabin after dark unless she invited him. He asked permission before touching the tools hanging in the barn, even when he desperately needed them. One evening, while searching for a measuring line, he found Thomas's old carpenter's square wrapped in cloth. Elias carried it directly to Margaret instead of using it. "Some tools belong to a man's memory," he said. "I won't take that from you." Margaret ran her thumb along the worn wooden edge. Thomas's initials were still carved into one corner. For a moment, grief rose inside her so sharply that she could not speak. Elias did not reach for her. He simply stood nearby and allowed her the dignity of her sorrow. At last. Margaret placed the square in his hands. Thomas believed tools were meant to build something that would outlive the person holding them. She said, "Use it for the windmill." Elias looked down at the square, then back at her. "I will treat it as if he were standing beside me." That night, Margaret understood that trusting Elias did not mean betraying the husband she had lost. Perhaps Thomas's memory was not a locked door. Perhaps it was a lantern showing her the way forward.
If you believe kindness can give a broken family another chance, subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are watching from today.
The next week, Margaret spent her last few pennies on sugar. She made wild plum jam for the children. The kitchen smelled sweet, tart, and like home. She watched Mary lick the wooden spoon. The girl's cheeks were finally turning a healthy pink. Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years, but the tension in this town was growing like a storm. A group of angry men came by the farm. They were led by Mr. Miller's young, arrogant nephew. They accused Elias of stealing a horse from the livery. It was an obvious lie meant to drive him away. They tried to provoke him into a violent fight. They kicked over his precious buckets of mortar. Elias stood his ground like an ancient, immovable oak tree. "Leave this land right now," he growled. The men saw the cold iron in his blue gaze. They left, but they promised to return with the law. Margaret was trembling as she watched them go. "They won't stop until they destroy us." "Elias, they want you gone, Sal. Let them try," he replied with a grim smile. He went straight back into the pit. He worked through the night by the flickering light of an oil lantern. By mid-August, the heat was absolutely unbearable. The grass crunched like broken glass underfoot. The town's main well was running dangerously low. But Elias was still digging deeper. He was over 20 feet down into the bedrock now. He had built a wooden derrick to haul up the heavy stone. Margaret helped him every single day. Her muscles ached and burned with the effort. She pulled the heavy ropes until her shoulders screamed. She believed in him with a ferocity that frightened her. That evening, the rope snapped while Elias was climbing from the shaft. Margaret heard the sharp crack and dropped to her knees beside the opening. For several terrible seconds, but there was only silence. Then Elias called up from the darkness. He had caught one of the timber braces before falling far, but his shoulder had struck the stone wall. Margaret lowered another rope and helped pull him to the surface. His face was pale with pain, and one arm hung stiffly at his side. "The digging stops," she said. "At least until you can lift that arm."